Hello and welcome into the Cubs on Deck podcast. I am one of your hosts. My name is Greg Huss, and today I am joined by Greg Zumak, and I'm joined by him because it is MLB Draft season, man. It is time. It's happening.
Yeah, I can't wait. This is what I live for every year. I'm just super excited to be able to do this and to be able to talk about it. It's going to be a busy week for a lot of people, and so I'm hoping that we can kind of dive in. If you're a novice to this, we're going to start at the basics, and then we'll keep going. But also, if you're a big hardcore draft fan, I think this would be a fun episode for you.
Yeah, I think this is the episode every year where we get the biggest diverse. The crowd that's listening to this episode is probably much different than what's typical. We get some people that are way more focused on draft stuff that are listening for the first time, but we also get people that aren't interested in draft stuff at all that just tune out for this, and it's totally fine. I'll preface all of this by saying this year, more than any in the past several years, I am not in tune with what's going on as far as draft stuff goes. So this is Greg Zumak. This is your show. This is your show here. I'm just kind of facilitating conversation here a little bit more than anything. So you're not hopped on the podcast by yourself, just talking at a crowd. But yeah, so I guess for those of you out there listening and you're kind of concerned about not knowing what's going on in the draft, like same. So join in on the fun. It should be a fun episode here.
Yeah, I completely agree. And so hey, this is the MLB draft is a niche topic, but it matters. And so I think even if you're kind of a novice to this and you just want to jump in and hear some thoughts and like, why should I care? What does this matter? We'll talk about a little bit of background on that. And the Cubs are seeing some impact even from last year. So, some of these things aren't always a 5, 6, 7 year kind of down the line thing. And so, I think this is a good topic, good timing, and happy to dive into it with you.
Exactly. So we're going to start off slow here. We're going to start off for the people who have
Excellent.
no idea what's going on, and eventually our last topic of conversation here is sleeper picks. So that will be at the very end for the kind of deep cuts down towards the end of the episode here. But we're going to start off, like I said, with some MLB draft basics. The Chicago Cubs are selecting 13th in the first round this year.
Right.
The draft is happening. This episode's coming out. We're recording on June 30th. And the episode is going to be coming out on the 4th, actually. So for all of your July 4th listening needs, this is when the episode will be dropping. And that means that the draft is coming up this weekend. So the first round will be taking place on Sunday. And then, the first and second rounds will be taking place on Sunday, with rounds 3 through 10 on Monday. And the remainder of the draft is on Tuesday. So what am I like? What do I need to look out for? What's next? Like, what do I need to know as far as basics go, Zumak?
So if we're going to talk basics, let's talk about why the MLB draft is different than any of the others. Because if you are, let's say you're a draft fan, I like the drafts. I think they're fun. I think they're exciting. And so even though I don't tune into like hockey quite as much, I was paying attention to the NHL draft. I clearly have a problem. But, that kind of a draft, the NFL draft, the NBA draft, all of these other major sports, it goes really, while there's some surprises, players are generally picked based on their talent level. And so if you're kind of thinking, well, why would that not happen in the MLB? Just keep in mind that there's some differences there. And that's related to how contracts are decided for signing bonuses. In the MLB draft, each team it's really built over two phases. Phase one is the first 10 rounds. Those 10 rounds, every team in baseball is given a particular slot value for a particular pick for that selection. And what is interesting, though, is that unique to baseball, with some minor exceptions, you can spend that money in the first 10 rounds almost however you want. There are some exceptions. We can talk about that here as we go along. But in general, if you've got, like as the Cubs do, let's look at their total amount here. They have $8,962,000 to spend over those first 10 rounds. And there's a little bit of overage in there too. They can spend up to about 5% over that without incurring much of any penalties. And so that's a lot of money. It's kind of middle of the pack for MLB teams, middle to a little bit slightly below the average amount there. And so if they want to buy a player down, they could do that. If they want to in that first couple rounds, pick somebody that would get a lower than recommended slot value, they can bank some of that money to spend it on other teams or other players down the line. That's those first 10 rounds. That's where the majority of the action happens.
And you want to give a little bit of an example of kind of what that looks like? I know like Cade Horton and
Yeah.
Jackson Ferris is a pretty prime example of saving money, spending extra money than the slot value.
Without a doubt. So when I say like you might save money, if you look on Cubs Twitter, you would be immediately, and this happened complete like right after Cade Horton. The Cubs are cheap. They're going discount. They're just saving the money. Tom Ricketts doesn't want to spend. That's honestly baloney. I'm not here to stick up for anybody in the Cubs organization or anything. It's just baloney. The Cubs have always spent over the amount that they're allotted every single year. Cade Horton is a perfect example of that. So what they did is they saved a good amount of money on his selection. He was projected to go probably about the 12th, 13th, 14th pick and signed for about that recommended slot value. The Cubs banked that money and then immediately threw it. They bought a player down. There were a couple that they were talking to. This isn't inside information from the Cubs. This is just from information that we found out later from those close to the players. Will say that there were a few players that they were trying to buy down there. One of them was Noah Schultz, who ultimately ended up being a first-round pick of the White Sox. The other ultimately ended up being Jackson Ferris, who went for a $3 million, well over the slot value, primarily because they saved so much money on Cade Horton. It happens to be that kind of deal looks amazing now because Cade Horton is, just whiffing fools left and right in high
Mm-hmm.
A. It looks like he's ready for double A. Jackson Ferris is showing some pretty frontline stuff. Obviously, still a longer development path there, but that's the kind of way you can move money around. An example of the opposite direction would be what Cincinnati did, in which Cam Collier was a guy who was projected to go right around where the Cubs were selecting, right about 7, 7, 8, 6, 7, 8, maybe a little bit beyond that. Ultimately, he just ended up not being selected. He still had a relatively high ask. And so what Cincinnati did is they bought him down with about $5 million signing bonus. And so, they were picking much further down in the draft, and to be able to buy that talent down, for that team, they viewed that was the best way to spend their money. So you can kind of move things around a little bit. There's some exceptions. You can't take somebody up at the top with you can't take somebody up at the top and offer them like, you know, 3, 10% of what the slot value is. There are
Yeah.
some restrictions in that. But by all accounts, you can be very, very flexible with that money. And the Cubs have shown a couple different ways that they're willing to do that.
Yeah, and I know that in past years we've seen the Cubs go after in the latter part of those first 2 days, like picks 7 through 10 ish or so. We've seen them go after some fourth year senior type
Yeah.
players where they will not like they're not going back to college. They don't
Yeah.
have a whole lot of leverage to go back to college, so those signing bonuses for those players are significantly below their slot. And they've done that so that they can go over slot on a guy like Jackson Ferris by quite a bit in the second round. So it's a constant balance, and it's a good example of going back to what you said at the beginning of all this. The picks are not necessarily slotted in with their talent levels, right? So Cade Horton is, or well, I guess that's a bad example because he's absolutely killing it this year. But like if you see a guy going 1, 2, 3 overall, that might not necessarily mean that they are the first, second, and third best players in this draft if they get for if they sign for an underslot bonus. So
Yeah, without a
go ahead.
doubt. So can I give you just a quick example of how that
Yeah,
could even
exactly.
look? So in my upcoming 20 round mock, which is quite an endeavor, I don't know how teams do this, and they have to have a lot more information to factor in. But I built an entire 20 round mock that's going to be debuted at Northside Bound next week. And so, not too much of a spoiler, but a little bit of a preview on that. It was structured in a way that the Cubs went, prep player at 13. Their next selection is at 68. They actually would have, in my mock, this is just my, creation there. They actually save a little bit of money at 68 and then spend a lot of money in those next 2 picks, where exactly what you're talking about, the top 4 guys might all be the top 4 talented guys, but it may not be in that order.
Mhm.
Look for signing bonus to somewhat correspond to the type of talent versus where somebody is selected in the draft.
Exactly, exactly. All right, so the Cubs select at 13th overall. I know there's been plenty of mock drafts, whether they're yours, they are Baseball America, Prospects Live, MLB Pipeline. Just take your pick on who is conducting the mock drafts. There's plenty of them out there. But do you want to focus in on pick number 13? I know we can talk a lot
Yeah,
about the
of
draft
course.
as a whole, but this first round pick is always the most hyped up, leading into the pick, and then also coming out of the pick after the deed is done.
It has to be. It has the most opportunity cost with the pick. And chances are your top pick is still going to be the one that corresponds to the highest value. So if you're sinking X amount of millions of dollars, you really want to be right on it.
Hmm.
And so we've seen the Cubs be mocked all over the place. I think there are some really good, well created mocks out there. And so just a brief snippet about, and I will echo, this is not my comment, but I totally agree with the sentiment. I want to give credit and then share it. Joe Doyle, who does his work at Future Star Series, he's recently moved from Prospects Live to Future Star Series, but he also has his Overslot podcast. So, I don't get any kickbacks on that. I just think it's a really good podcast if you're into the MLB draft. He talked about this, where if you're looking at mock drafts, the player that's listed that's actually mocked to the pick is the least important part. Sometimes those are right, but honestly, it's the blurb that is going to be the most important. And so when we
Hmm.
dive into it, that's the first thing I look at when I look at mock drafts. And I'm not here to say that I do better mock drafts than Jim Callis or Jonathan Mayo or these people that
I
are
can say
so
you can't
ingrained
say
into
that.
the
I
game.
can say that though.
Well, thank you. I'm not sure I would agree with all of that. I like to put some detail into it, but I would not. there's a lot of really spectacular professionals, but
Yes.
I will say that if you look as a whole, the type of detail with the blurbs are going to be very different depending on who you look at. And so I'm a huge Jim Callis fan. I think towards as he gets close into the draft, he really starts to zero in on things. I think Kylie McDaniel here's a lot of really good information that's kind of interspersed. I really do respect Joe Doyle. I think he does a really good job at that. And even like Keith Law, I know he gets a lot of flack and stuff, but I think he does a well constructed mock on that. I don't always agree with everything that everybody says, but I could also be wrong too. But I think that those are some detailed mocks. The least important mocks you're going to see are the ones that just list the names. I'm not here to denigrate anybody who does that, because I think there's still a lot of effort that goes into them. But those don't provide you the value of it. And so what you want to look for with these mocks is the blurbs. What are the common threads that people are hearing? And so there are a few threads that folks are hearing, and I think that it conceptually makes sense. One of which is, hang out here if you're not a huge fan of this demographic, but they're hearing that, look, if some of the top couple pitchers in the draft happen to fall, that makes a lot of sense for the Cubs. They've been very successful on that. I'm not going to attribute that to Carter Hawkins, which I'm not sure that that's necessarily the reason. I think it's the infrastructure that the Cubs have built would be
Hmm.
the reason that they might look for pitching, but also just the specific players. If you're hoping for the generational talent Paul Skeens to make it to 13, I'm not sure he would have a right arm if he was available on the board at 13. So I think the Cubs would pass on him regardless. But there are other names out there that are available, such as Rhett Lauder, who's a right-handed pitcher out of Vanderbilt. I'm sorry, Wake Forest. Similar
Same
color
colors.
scheme. Yeah, exactly. And then, we also see Hurston Waldrop out of Florida and Chase Dollander out of Tennessee. I'd probably, rank them Skeens, Lauder, Dollander, Waldrop personally. People may disagree with that, but that's kind of how I'd see it. And I think, if Lauder or Dollander happened to be there, I mean, I think the Cubs would have to consider it. Depending on what Waldrop is asking, maybe that's the case, but there's some pretty significant development steps that would need to take place there. So, those are some common things that folks are hearing is, it could be a college pitcher.
And
But before we
all
jump into
three
that, what do you want to
all of those guys are guys that we got the chance to see during the College World Series this year, which is super
Yeah.
super fun. I think that one of my favorite parts about the MLB draft is how it coincides. I know it's changed the timing over the past few years or so, but the relationship between the MLB draft and the College World Series, which I try to watch some college or some college baseball games during the regular season. Always doesn't always go as planned, but I'm sure to be sitting in front of the TV every as many outs as I possibly can for the College World Series because it's just electric baseball. I've talked about it on this podcast before. It's just like it is a different type of baseball watching those guys go out there and compete. And so we got to see Dollander, we got to see
Mhm.
Waldrop, and we got to see Rhett Lauder go out there and compete pitch for pitch with Paul Skeens did Lauder. So those are all really exciting guys. A lot of energy from those guys too, and they all three kind of do different things on the mound.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, they're very different pitchers. So this isn't even like a, if you prefer one type of profile pitcher, and I'll take Skeens completely out of it, right? We were talking about that. But if you're looking at like Louder, Dollander, Waldrop, they are each individually so different that if you're like, well, this is the type of profile of our pitcher that we want, and then that guy's gone, you may not value those other two like much at all.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Louder is probably the one that gets the most consistent comments nationwide that he's probably not going to be there at 13. And that's just because he represents a really safe profile. He's
Yes.
really good. He looks like a no doubt starter at the next level. It's change up first, but his slider is really good. The chatter about him not having velocity is, I think, a little bit overblown. He averaged about 93 this year. Um, you know, I I think he's bumped it up to like 97, 98 this year. And so like Louder would be one that, hey, if I'm the Cubs, I think you just take the value play. You just run to the podium, you give him the full slot bonus, and you go. Where the difficult choice lies in is Chase Dollander and Hurston Waldrop. And depending on who you kind of ask and depending on how you view those players, is going to be really different. Chase Dollander entered the year as a very legitimate 1-1 guy. When I say 1-1, I mean first overall pick. And I don't think that had the season progressed, even if he looked like he did last year, that he would. I think that we've just seen some guys go supernova, but he would be right there, like top 2, 3, 4 type of players. And it's just been inconsistent. We've seen different shapes of the ball. The command has taken a step back. The big question is that fixable? I think there's a lot of people in baseball who would say, yeah, it is, and we've got our own plan for what that looks like. But it just depends on how you feel internally. Guys like Chase Dollander and Hurston Waldrum aren't low maintenance. They just are you want to feel confident in your development plan with them, and if you
Mm-hmm.
do, you may have a really special pitcher.
How do those guys just real quickly? How do those three guys compare to what we've seen the Cubs go after in the draft in past years? I mean, I know that we're talking
Yeah,
about Cade, especially college arms, right? Cade
right.
Horton, and last year we saw it wasn't just Cade Horton they went after in later rounds. We saw Connor Nolan, we saw Brody McCullough, we saw Brandon Birdsell, and then in last year or the year prior, we had the Jordan Wicks year where he was
Right.
taken in the first round. So how do those three guys specifically compare to what we've seen in past drafts?
It's great you brought up Jordan Wicks, and obviously it feels very pertinent here. But he also is a really interesting comp for Rhett Lauder in the sense that Jordan Wicks didn't pitch for somebody like Wake, which has a very very advanced pitching development program. I mean,
Hmm.
it is well respected. There are nationwide articles put out about that group.
A lot
Um,
of MLB like pitch labs were modeled off of what Wake Forest did
yes,
prior.
there are individuals, I won't mention them by name, but I mean, you can find them online that have gone from, components of that pitch lab as far as people, to really significant roles within major league organizations. So yeah, that is an enormous kind of foundation there. But the type of profile of pitcher that they are is fairly similar in the sense that the fastball's not overpowering, though Lauder's got a little bit more velocity, but it's changeups where and control and command is where they really kind of live. And so that's what gets if you were to ask some fans, I think that's what gets fans less excited about Lauder, but he's a really damn good pitcher.
Hmm.
And that's why he probably isn't going to last. he would be a low maintenance type of arm. There's not really much you need to do. He's already effectively had some pretty close to pro level tutelage. And
Hmm.
so, if you're a team that doesn't feel as confident in developing pitchers like the Rockies, maybe the Angels, not here to knock anybody, but they could probably plug Rhett Lauder in, allow him to just keep progressing up. And that's generally why I think most folks think he'll be gone by pick 11.
Yeah.
If we were to compare Waldrop and Dollander to anybody else that is really interesting, I'm not sure I can come up with a comparable for Waldrop. The foul just needs a lot of work. The other pitches are spectacular.
Yeah.
Like the split change is lethal. It's probably the best pitch in college baseball. Um, but there's going to need to be significant work on the fastball. I'll just kind of leave it at that.
So you're talking about mock drafts, and that's kind
Yeah.
of a profile, that college arm, that if those guys fall to the Cubs, which we saw with Jordan Wicks, where he fell to the Cubs at their pick back a couple of years ago at 16, then we could see one of those guys go at 13 to the Cubs this year, assuming they don't fall, or assuming that one of them falls the Cubs don't necessarily like in terms of fitting with what their strategy is in developing pitchers. What's another profile that we might see go at 13?
So I'll talk pretty broadly, but like opportunistic. If those guys go, let's say you're talking about three of the top four, and we say Waldrop falls, for whatever reason. I don't know how that's going to go, but let's say for your example there, you're talking obvious names that are going to be off the board, which was the top five: Cruz, Skeens, Langford, Clark, Jenkins are all gone, plus Lauder and Dollander. And so right off the bat, you're talking about 7, 8 picks, along with a couple other people that are just probably not going to be there. Kyle Teal, let's for instance, and you start kind of going down the list of, what, there's probably going to be some surprises in the top 12. And then it comes into play of, okay, well, if those guys are off the table, the obvious ones are off the table, there's a couple surprises, then who's sitting there? And
Yeah.
there might be some really, really good talents, one of which could be like a Braden Taylor, who is a third baseman at TCU. I got to watch him at the College World Series, extremely patient. I think it's fair to wonder maybe how he stacks at third base long term, but overall, I think he's technically sound. That would be a guy that he entered the season pretty clearly in the top 10. If he falls to 13, that's not really that big of a knock. And boy, he would make a lot of sense. Cubs need a third baseman. You don't draft for need, but wow, when it all kind of lines up, that's great. There could also be some high school hitters. And we've seen them connected to a few different names. And so I'll talk about like Colin Hook. I don't really know how to pronounce it, and I really need to figure that out. Aiden Miller is another one that's been linked to them. Even Trent Caraway, who I've spoken to on this podcast, has been somebody that's been linked nationally to them, and I'm a big fan of. He would be a money saving pick. And so, we start to see like Arjun Namala, Cole Emerson, just some of these other guys kind of that should go in that range. They're high school players that I think any one of them could make some sense. Internally, be interesting to see how the Cubs kind of rank those guys. But I would think, him, Kevin McGonigal, some of those other names would make a lot of sense. College hitter, I don't know. Matt Shaw is another one that should probably go in that range. I don't know if he's really an infielder long term, but maybe the Cubs disagree on that. Tommy Troy, we can't go podcasts not mention Tommy Troy because I think he's probably somewhere in that range. Big power, chases a little bit, could benefit from some more launch, but we started to see a really good, example of how he could do that later in the season. And then I'll leave it at one last one, which is kind of an interesting one that I would say I don't love this demographic in general, but like we've seen him connected to him and he probably goes somewhere in that range. That is a prep right-hander out of Jesuit High School, Noble Meyer. Noble Meyer is the consensus top prep arm in the class. He generates swing and miss. The fastball is really good. It's got some sinker type qualities, so you probably want to add to the repertoire there. The slider is hellacious. It's really nasty arm. I think the changeup is actually pretty good too. And if you talk to people within the game, they're like, this is a future frontline guy. Prep right-handers, especially, have risks.
Hmm.
And so I think that's probably the only risk to it. Um, but extremely well respected as a talent. I wouldn't. While I don't love that profile, that particular player, it's like, boy, that'd be a pretty special arm. So, I know I'm casting a wide net. I'm doing it intentionally because I don't think the Cubs even know where they're going,
Yeah.
but nor are they going to tell me. But I think that they're going to be fairly opportunistic, and those are some of the names that are probably around there. Maybe for a slot saving money, you could also talk about Nolan Schonel, who I've talked about on this podcast as well, first baseman at FAU. So some names to kind of think about in the top 13.
Yeah, I love that you're kind of throwing out all these names because being in that teens drafting range, being at 13 is really interesting because you got to balance guys that are falling down to you because there will be surprises like you mentioned or guys that you feel really passionately about. I think another thing to point out with this is that the Cubs after they select at 13, they don't select until what 68.
68, very
Thank you.
close
Yeah.
to
68.
a fun number, but yeah,
Yeah.
68. It's a
So
wide range.
it's a wide range. It gets really tough. Is like y- if you have your guy, if the Cubs have that guy that they think might get selected between 40 and 60, then do they pull the trigger and save some money on the pick at 13? They're in just a really unique range in this draft. In past years, they've been right around here too,
Mhm.
and we saw them go after last year. They went after Cade Horton, which was a guy that we expected going into the draft to be drafted way lower, like you mentioned in the teens, and they selected him at 6, right? 6,
7,
yeah,
but yeah,
7,
yeah.
yeah. And then a couple of years ago, we saw Jordan Wicks fall down to them at their selection. The year prior to that, Ed Howard fell down to them.
Mhm.
We've seen them like take advantage of that, and which is something that we've seen the Cardinals do to a T the past several years too, where they just select the best available of the guys that have fallen down the draft board to them.
Yeah, I love the strategy, and obviously I'm a little biased here, but I love the strategy of this guy shouldn't even be on the board. Let's correct that.
Hmm.
And you just get really good players like that's what happens. You should be creative though, and like Cade Horton's a great example of they he was totally justified to be on the board there. The feedback that I've gotten inside outside, different groups is that Cade Horton was gone in the next couple picks. So it wasn't
Hmm.
some big like, whoa, the Cubs surprised the world. It was not Texas Rangers popping Kumar Rocker. That was
Yeah,
very different. But no, Cade Horton was gone in the next few picks. But that's a way to be creative. Whereas the other two picks were under the Dan Kenfrid's era, were just like, hey, this guy shouldn't be on the board. Let's just take
exactly.
him. There's good and bad with that, but like, yeah, it's fun.
So who do you think is more so, whether just the vibe feels right? Who do you think is more so on the Cubs radar? You threw a whole bunch of names there. If
Yeah.
you were to narrow it down to just a few, who is kind of your expectation to go there at 13?
If Chase Dollander is there, I think with where the Cubs are from a pitching development standpoint, and I'm assuming a few names are just definitely off the board. Like I'm
Yes.
assuming
Yes.
Louder is off the board. But if Chase Dollander is there, if you believe that the guy who's the 1-1 pitching candidate in the class is still in there, and I think it probably is. The Cubs have the infrastructure to take
Yeah.
a swing there. Can't have enough pitching, and you can still get creative later in the draft, as long as he's not asking for like 6 million or something. I think, yeah. I mean, I think he would just make sense. You got to have a pretty firm development plan with it, but yeah, I think that'd be good. Some other guys that we've seen connected, and I guess just conceptually would make sense, right? Like Aiden Miller entered the year. He's a third baseman. He entered the year consistently in that range, and then he broke his hamate bone, which in his hand. We've seen that long term that doesn't have much of an effect. And the word is that he's doing well at showcases now. So, like I think this has been public out there that he had a really good showcase in like Milwaukee or something like that. It was one of those kind of teen areas, and maybe he did more too, but that would be the kind of guy that it's just like, well, he was projected here the whole time. He may not have even been able to be available at pick 13, but he is now, and so I think it's those kind of players. We haven't heard a lot of buzz on like, we haven't heard a lot of buzz on like the Kevin McGonagalls or whatever, but some team could just be laying there in the weeds on that. So yeah, I think that those would be the type of guys. Add in Braden Taylor, and I'll throw out one name that I haven't mentioned, but like I'll coalesce this at four. Um, is that we haven't talked about Jacob Gonzalez much out of Ole Miss, and he entered the year kind of in that consistent top five.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so maybe the Cubs never thought they'd have a play at him, and now he could be available. So, I'll leave it at there, just because I think that those would be names that could make sense. And but really, any of the ones I've talked about wouldn't surprise me, and that's just kind of the fun of the draft.
Yeah, I think that makes it much more consumable from a fan's perspective. Like from
Yeah,
anybody listening that doesn't quite dig quite as deep, is being on the lookout for those four names, right? Jacob Gonzalez,
yeah,
Braden Taylor, Aiden Miller, and Chase Dollander. If you can
yeah,
kind of keep an eye out for those four guys, if those four guys are on the board, then maybe hone in and focus on those four names going to the Cubs with their selection. I think that's
yeah.
that's good.
One of my goals with this podcast is not just to have Greg Huss be super creative in his clip editing and have me throw out like 20 names and have me list one and be like, we nailed it. Because honestly, I don't have a sense for where things are going right now. But those four names I think conceptually would make the most sense to me. And hey, I could be totally wrong, but I think from an overall standpoint, that's how I would see it 2 weeks before the draft almost.
Here's what we could do. We could just spend the rest of this episode and we take
Naming
all those
guys.
names you mentioned and you just say the sentence, I think the Cubs will draft
Hmm.
Aiden Miller. And then you say that for every player, and then I'll go back and clip whichever one you're right on, and we're good to go. You're famous.
That's the way to do it. And make sure if you're listening here and you want gems like this, make sure to subscribe on YouTube. We have the handle right down there at the bottom. But if you want gems with Greg Huss making me look amazing or trying his best, honestly, because then I would do that for half an hour and then it wouldn't even be one of those guys. But no, make sure you subscribe. But yeah, that's the kind of thing, right? Like that's the kind of fun of it. So those are the picks at 13, but we know that the draft is much bigger than that.
Yeah, and I think that leads into you wanted to talk a little bit about some guys rising up late here. Some guys that might be worthy of keeping an eye on. And when I picture risers, right? Well, I guess more sleep. We'll get into risers and then we'll get into sleepers. I think
Yeah.
that I'm excited for sleepers, but as far as risers, you mentioned a few names that are guys that might fly up to 13. Are you thinking risers as far as first round, second round? Where are you going with this one?
Yeah, I mean, a few different places with it, right? Like the College World Series is a really big area that are a way for these players to look very very good, right? The ones that showed out, and they showed out on the national stage, and they showed out against really dominant pitching, and so like that's a really big factor here. But we also have some guys that are probably in that second or third round range, or that are moving up maybe a round or two, and part of that was we haven't even talked about the MLB Draft Combine, which is where players can go. They go and they show out with wood bats, or on TrackMan. They get Hawkeye. They get the most elite type of data collection possible, and so we can actually get a sense with calibrated instruments. Who's really doing what, who's really throwing what, who's hitting what, and that can matter a little bit more. So let's just talk about a couple risers here from the College World Series that I saw. I really like Josh Rivera, shortstop out of Florida. He's a pro shortstop. I have zero doubt in my mind on that. It's hard to find them in college. That is a pro shortstop. He's not a perfect player. In fact, this is probably the first like really good year he's had. He's been okay a couple years at Florida, and he's older. But I think a team is going to take him maybe in like the second round, offer him a little bit below slot, because he's older. Like we talked about, move some of that money around, but just take a guy that you're like, this is a pro shortstop. And if the Cubs had a pick, you know, maybe a little bit sooner than 68, I'd really be all about that, to be honest.
Yeah, that gets rough, right? We talk about
Yeah.
that gap between picks where guys like him are probably going to go before the Cubs selected at number 68, and it's like you're losing out on some high quality talent there. Is there anybody else? I know that I had a ton of guys that I was watching
Oh yeah.
and just enjoying during the College World Series, but it's a combination of watching them for this year, watching them for next year. We'll see where the Cubs, how bad the Cubs downslide or get better over the course of this season to see where they select a year from now. So that's a topic of conversation for later. But anybody else from the College World Series specifically that you liked, that even if it's not a first round pick, even if it's not a second round pick, that are rising up because of their performance in the World Series?
Yeah, I mean, I really liked watching Cade Denton out at Oral Roberts. I just think he was a really fun arms, total bullpen package, but he looked really good. That's not a first, second round guy, not a third rounder. He's probably deeper than that, but he's just a guy that I just really, really enjoyed watching. Saw him up close. He didn't actually even have the best outing, but when I saw him, but he just looked overall like you could see the raw ingredients there. Yeah, I would say, we can jump into some other players, other demographics. You can certainly throw out names that impressed you too, and I'm happy to weigh in on that if you'd like.
Yeah, I was
But
just enjoying some baseball, really.
yeah, it was a blast. Oh man,
Yeah.
I mean, I've been to Cubs playoff games, but it still had like a buzz energy in Omaha. It's
Mhm.
great. I've got my
Yeah,
Omaha
I love it.
baseball shirt from Baseballism. I don't get a cut from mentioning that. I just really like their stuff. I think it's really quality.
What
Um,
about there was the draft combine that you mentioned,
yes.
and there's a whole lot of good data being thrown around there, and you're kinda getting especially for some of these high school guys, I think that's really, really
Mhm.
important, both from the data perspective and from the, not having to watch a video on a mom's grainy cell phone. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, I a lot Namala, right? The Arjun
Kamala.
Namala
Yep.
from Florida. I've seen plenty of videos of him, but they were like taken from like the stands at a high school baseball game. It's like, oh, this looks impressive, but like, how impressive is it really? And then he goes and we're getting some actual footage of
Yep.
him and other guys at the combine. It's like we're getting an open face shot of him in the batting cages down in Arizona. We're seeing where the ball's landing in the ballpark. Like that's huge for fans and for GMs, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So a few guys at the combine that impressed me. One of them I got to see earlier in the year. I wrote a piece at Northside Bound just related to who I saw live looks in Omaha. One of them is Brock Vandenberg. I just really like the profile. He's hulking first baseman, 6'7". You would think that it would just be this massive like whiffs and 3 true outcomes, massive power. And it's really not. Guy's a total throwback. He will go the other way. He doesn't chase. He makes pretty good contact. You'll hear different arguments as far as like how athletic he is. I think he's pretty solid. Probably could benefit from some pro level strength and conditioning. But Michigan State first baseman really liked him. He's a guy that did, I think, very well at the combine. You mentioned Amala. There's a couple other guys there that got a lot of publicity. Brandon Winokur, who was an outfielder out of high school, and he just looked great. There's been a few articles out there. I watched his batting practice. I just was super impressed with what I was seeing. The fluidity started to improve. I just think he's going to be a really dynamic player. I have no idea if he's going to be available at 68. I hope he is. I think that'd be really fun. But he just looks like he's going to be very, very good. I think those are a few of the standouts there. It was great to see Cam Johnson, who is out of IMG. He's a left-hander that I thought he could be a first round caliber guy earlier in the year. Kind of hurt, had some kind of arm injury. I don't know if that's been there was an injury has been public. I don't know if the specifics were out there. They probably are. And but that was the big question, right? Like if he's hurt, that's really hard, and he's an LSU commit. But he came out and he was firing bullets. And so it's not even like the guy had a lot of rust on it or he's throwing, 91, 94 instead of 96, 98. No, he was throwing full velocity and stuff really looked nasty. So I think he made a lot of money there. Good for him. I would love Cam Johnson. I don't know if it happens, but those are a few of the guys that just stood out to me this week.
And the Cubs obviously have enjoyed drafting out of IMG Academy in past years. They got Drew Gray a couple of years ago. They got Jackson Ferris last year. That's a common place they've been going to for these pitchers in early draft rounds. So that makes sense.
Yeah, maybe the Cubs have the right of first refusal if you're a left-hander out of IMG. I don't know. I hope so because that'd be a really fun thing. But yeah, there were some really talented players that played at the draft combine. I heard from a few guys that said it was a great experience. Some of them they're a little bit like awe-inspired of who they were talking to, who was around them, who was talking about them right behind them. I think that was a unique dynamic. I could do with a little less of the commentary, to be honest, from
Yeah.
some of the. I won't call out specific names, but it just kind of like let the guy hit, because you can hear the with the delay, like they're talking behind that person, and they'll say something, and then you can see like the player like do like a wait what
React.
kind of thing.
Yeah.
Which, hey, I don't know, maybe there's some benefit in that too, but it was a
Yeah.
fun experience.
Let's spend the remainder of this episode here, another 10 minutes or so, talking about some sleepers, because that's what I love hearing from you the most. I know
Yeah,
that getting to know the first round, potential first round picks is always important, and getting your perspective is always good. But that's also something that we can dive in a little bit easier into all these publications rather than these sleepers, right? Sleepers
right.
are not something that's easy to come by. It's easy to find. You know all of these players, and so I think that it's nice to get kind of a Cliff Notes version of this from you. I always look back at the James Triantos situation. I think it's easy to
Yeah, that
point
one
out
was
that
crazy.
situation where like you were on that James Triantos draft pick in the second round a few years ago. And being able to kind of identify those players is super, super important, because those are the players that they're sleepers. We're not hearing about them now, but like they become really important depth in the system, right? And I'm not talking
Yeah,
like depth in terms of like the guys ranked 30th through 40th. I'm talking about the guys that are ranked in that like 8 to 12 range or so in the system. I specifically called this out in my prospect ranking that I dropped. That we had prospect week this past week. My ranking, I called out kind of the third tier of players that or
hmm,
I guess the fourth tier of players that I think are really, really important. It's not the PCA tier. It's not the top 100 guys tier, like the Alcantara's and the Owen Casey's of the world. It's not even that third tier where I kind of defined as being the Miguel Amaya and Jackson Ferris, where it's like I could listen to an argument that they're back to top 100.
right.
It's that fourth tier where it's like guys that are pretty clearly not like touching top 100 range. But in years past, those guys that are now ranked 9 through like 17 or so, in years past, they would have been clearly a top 5 guy in the system. And so, like, creating that quality depth in the system with a guy like James Triantos, with a guy that's kind of ranked in that range, is super, super important. I have like Cole Franklin at the back end. I know I'm a little bit higher on Cole Franklin, but like those that high quality depth of
Yeah.
additions to the prospect list are important with these sleeper guys. So who do you have as somebody that we should keep an eye on as fans?
Yeah, well, okay, so with that kind of framework, you're still probably talking about a close to a first round type of caliber guy.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe not somebody that's right there.
And it doesn't have to be right now, right? Like I think that
Yeah,
that's important. Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off,
no,
but I think that it's important to like understand that a guy that we're at all considering a sleeper or even falling into this range does not necessarily like immediately become the ninth best prospect in the system. It might be a guy that we need to see a year in pro ball, get acclimated to pro baseball, and then he joins like that range of prospect. You know what I mean?
yeah, you know what? That's a fun one. So let me throw out a couple names to you because I think one of them folks probably saw in the College World Series, and that's Tommy Hawk. He's a center fielder. Just now thinking of the pun that he's a ball hawk out in center field. I'm sure somebody else has come up with that, but I'm disappointed I hadn't already thought about that. But just that guy is your classic, like kind of grinder, makes good contact, probably could stand to hit the ball a little bit harder, but he can pull it to his pull side or, really generate power to his pull side. It's a guy that probably gets taken in like the third, fourth round or whatever. He will be in my 20 round mock. And that's somebody who, in a couple years, all of a sudden, he just looks like, maybe he's outfield depth, but maybe he's a center fielder for you. I know the Cubs may not need that if PCA really shows out, but you can't guarantee any of these things. And so I like him as somebody that in a couple years he finds himself in that top 15 type of range.
Can I throw
And
a little comp
yeah,
out for
yeah,
Tommy Hawk?
please do.
I think that it's interesting with Tommy Hawk that Like I think he's just like a poor man's version of Enrique Bradfield, who
Mm,
another guy that's kind of in the Cubs' first round range there a
right.
little bit. We've seen Bradfield mocked to the Cubs kind of earlier on, less so now. But I'd say a couple months ago we saw Enrique Bradfield being mocked to the Cubs quite a bit, multiple different mocks. Tommy Hawk feels just like a poor man's version of that.
Yeah, actually, I really like that. That's pretty fair. He is an interesting dude in the sense that that he's not going to be the guy that's popping 20 home runs, but all of those other skills are just super valuable, and they will probably be more and more valuable out in the game going
Mhm.
forward. So yeah, I like that. I think that's fun. That's not one I would have thought of, but he does a lot of the same contact. I don't think his chase is too bad. Just trying to pull up the data really quick, and I couldn't remember that. But yeah, yeah, and then showed out at the national stage, and I think that matters to teams.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that if you're hitting 360 for a team in the ACC, then that's a pretty good quality to have.
Yep. I'll toss out another name that I've seen many times in my time out at Oregon, and that's Garrett Forrester, who's a first baseman. Excellent data. This is the type of profile of a player that is never on a top 100 list. Just doesn't make a top 100 list. First basemen are hard to find on that group. You have to be a really elite person to probably do it. But just generates contact, hits the ball hard, doesn't chase. Some guy that probably goes, in rounds, maybe a slot saving pick in two, but probably more like three, four, five, six, and just keeps climbing up the ladder. And you look at it in a year and you're like, yeah, of course this guy's in double A and he's putting up a 125 WRC plus. And like that's the type of player that that you'd really like to take like a mid day two swing on because I feel like you'd get a lot out of it.
Yeah, I think that especially if the Cubs trust their development,
Hmm.
we talked about the hitting infrastructure, but if they trust or we talked about their pitching infrastructure, but I think the same goes for their hitting infrastructure, right? Where if you're
Yeah,
trusting the development of some of these guys, the Matt Mervises and Hayden McGeary's of the world are the prime examples of that. But like if you're trusting that those guys will continue to succeed as they climb up the ladder, then a guy like Forrester is probably somebody that you can take that chance on.
yeah. I want to go back to the Tommy Hawk and Enrique Bradfield Jr. thing
Okay.
because and I feel like I can share this data. This is fine because your comparison is like spot on just from a data perspective.
I'm the expert now.
It is this. I'm the expert now. Tommy Hawk had like a chase rate of about 17% and a contact rate of 87%. Where Enrique Bradfield was like 16 for chase, 85 for contact. Where it was different is how hard they hit the ball.
Yes.
And so that fits with your analogy like really perfectly. And I just think that's great. And I
Why
just
why
want to
draft why draft Enrique Bradfield when you can get Tommy Hawk in 2 or 3 rounds later?
Many are saying this. I don't know. I like EBJ too, but yeah,
Just
that's
draft
just a
both of
fun
them. Call
comp,
it a
man.
day.
Fun
Play
comp.
play him in play him in left center and right center, and then you're set. You
Yeah,
don't need a third outfielder.
with PCA and just never let a ball drop.
There you go.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like it. All right. What else do you have in mind as far as sleepers go?
Let me throw out one more here, and that's Matt Evans. He's actually a Canadian high school player, which I think would be really fun. And the Cubs were scouting Owen Casey, didn't end up working out, and obviously made the trade for him. But Matt Evans is the type of guy that might be a little bit of a slow burn, somebody that you just kind of watch over a couple years, but fits that type of profile if we're sitting there in 2 or 3 years where it's like, hey, that's the ninth best prospect in the system,
Hmm.
and I just like his game, and I think that a team is probably going to uh, really kind of enjoy that profile. He's committed to Nebraska, so I don't know anything about signability, but it might be somebody that you can get later on in the draft, throw him a little bit more than they would get at like from Nebraska with the scholarships and the NIL stuff, but I think it's a fairly affordable type of player. Again, I know nothing internal, or I wouldn't even say it, but that's the kind of guy that I would really be interested in. And I don't even think he's on Pipeline's 250, but if the Cubs popped him in the rounds like 11 through 20 and offered him a little bit over in that'd be kind of a fun guy to watch there.
That is the content I'm looking for.
There
That's
you
what
go.
I'm looking for. What kind of position, like what positionally are we looking at with Evans?
Outfielder. I haven't seen enough. It's really hard to get footage, so I can't say enough about like whether he's a center fielder or push to the corner. But outfield is generally what looks at. And yeah, I just having watched what I've watched and kind of dive into him a little bit with some people that have seen him. Yeah, I like the profile, and I'm he would just be kind of that late round. Oh, like they took a high schooler, and maybe they're actually going to sign them, kind of a thing, and he would fit the profile of somebody that I think could do that.
You're telling me that you couldn't track down outfield defense footage of a high school guy from Canada that's
No, I
unsupported?
mean, I do many wonders. I don't
That is
really,
not
but
one of them.
but that is hard considering they're probably playing
um,
in a gym sometimes.
exactly, yeah, and
Mhm,
I kind of pointed that out with Owen Casey, and
mhm,
that development becomes really really interesting. So kind of transitioning back to the kind of the draft as a whole here as we wrap
yeah,
things up. Um, in past years, we've always seen, I guess, with the 20 round draft now. That's what's happening these days in the draft. We'll see what if that changes in future years. I don't know, but with the 20 round draft, last year the Cubs went out and were able to sign all but one, I believe, or
all
all
but
but
one.
two of their all but one of their draft picks. Is
Yep.
that something that is normal? Is that something we should expect again this year? Now that there's a shorter draft than in past years.
Yeah, I'd bank. Well, I don't want to say I don't think the Cubs will sign all 20. I would
Hmm.
feel really confident that obviously I don't know their inside information here, but I'd be pretty shocked if they all signed all 20. And don't please don't scream from the heavens that that's a mistake. But with player contracts being limited and being more limited in the future, we are likely to see more teams, not take all 20 guys.
Hmm.
And the other factor here is that, at least the way I'm going to be structuring my 20 round mock coming up, there's going to be a player and I'm going to list it. And I'll, of course, say that I have no inside information, just fits the profile of a player that you take, uh, but you don't anticipate signing them. They're kind of
Hmm.
hedging your bet in case, one of the second or third round guys doesn't sign. And so that's probably like a pathway or something that the Cubs could have done last year, where if you're like, hey, we're pretty good, we're pretty confident, we've got Jackson Ferris's number, but let's say something happens, or
Hmm.
the college comes to the table with just a ton of money, and it's like, ooh, we're not going to be able to go to 3.2. We just don't have that. Then you have a backup, and I think it was like 19th rounders, Brock Blatter, almost said Block Bratter, but it was the first one. And I have no idea what his number would have been, but like that's the kind of thing where you're probably just hedging your bet there. I'm sure the Cubs would have loved to take him. I'm guessing that we're going to see the Cubs sign like 18 to 19 out of 20. That's my projection for going forward in like about a week and a half.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yep.
Anything else you want to hit on before we tell people how they can keep up with the draft?
It's going to be a fun week. I've teased the 20 round mock that's coming out, I believe, on Monday. I'm going to then try to have all this stuff is finalized now. But I'm going to be having a full first round mock that should drop sometime later in the week. Um, and then I'm hoping to have another piece out about my gut feel guys. So guys that I just happen to believe in. Some of them Cubs probably aren't going to draft, but I'd really like it. And then they're just guys that I believe on. Like last year, I was a big believer in Neto and Gilbert, and a little bit with Collier too. And so those are my gut feel guys last year. Triantos was the year before. And so, I'll have a small piece out on that. But what's interesting is that as we get basically into the 4th of July, I usually do a period where I go incognito. You're not going to see me online talking about the drafts. I try to talk to folks within the game with the total understanding of none of this is going to get published. My pieces are finalized. I think folks already know that I don't talk about stuff if it's asked to be off the record anyway. But just a total sense that I can kind of talk with people, ask them, hey, who's your guy in the region that you really want? Cubs and otherwise, and sometimes I won't get that information, but just a way to connect with folks within the game, wish them luck and stuff like that. So you won't see me actually jumping on a bunch of stuff later in the week. Pieces will be done and finalized. And a bunch of them are going to be hilariously wrong because we're going to get new intel on like Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And you know what? That's just the nature of it. It's kind of
Yeah,
fun.
I love it. So this past week was our prospect list week over at
Hmm.
Northside Bound. This week is draft week at Northside Bound, and really the next 2 weeks, right? This is a lot
Oh
of
yeah.
pre-draft stuff at Northside Bound, and then the draft is going to happen, and we'll have a lot of post-draft stuff, I'm sure. A little side note here. So I know that on this YouTube feed, if you're watching and listening on YouTube, we will have a live draft show like we've had last year at Northside Bound, and we've also hosted through Cubs Insider in past years. So this would be the 2020, 2021,
Third.
the third straight year. Yeah,
Yeah.
the third. Is it
Oh
the
no,
third year?
fourth.
Four. It's the
You
fourth.
and
It's the fourth
Jimmy.
year.
Yeah.
Me and Jimmy did it in 2020. So
Yeah.
this will be the fourth straight year of hosting a live draft
Hmm.
show, and Greg Zumak will be hosting that with Todd Johnson.
Hmm.
I will have to be sitting out of this one, but I will be watching along as you guys are doing your thing. So be sure to tune into that. That's always a blast. It's a long show. You got plenty to talk about. There'll be some graphics, all that good stuff. So be sure to check out the YouTube
Yeah.
page. If you're listening on wherever you get your podcast, then find your way over to the YouTube just for that one, because I don't think that show will be posted to our podcast feed at all. It'll be so like specific to what is going on in the exact moment. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to go on the podcast feed. And the other thing is the next episode here of Cubs on Deck will be a kind of a recap of what happened in the draft. So this is all of our episodes always drop on Tuesday mornings. This episode for the post draft recap will not be dropping on a Tuesday morning because the final rounds of the draft are happening on Tuesday afternoon and Tuesday evening. So you will probably be getting that the post draft episode either on Wednesday or Thursday of next week. So a little bit off with the timing. It's a little wonky, but I hope you guys will enjoy that post draft show. That'll be worth the wait, I'm sure. So
Absolutely. This is gonna be
besides
fun.
that,
Let's
you got
do it,
anything else?
man.
Yeah,
No,
yeah.
let's do it.
It's going to be really exciting in the next couple of weeks. Hopefully, you guys enjoy it. As always, give us a follow on any podcast platforms. Give us a subscription here on YouTube. We're trying to continue expanding that platform quite a bit. Leave a comment in the comments below, all that good stuff. And in the meantime, we will be back in your ears in a little over one short week. Thanks, guys. Take care.